You were told Africa was empty. They lied to you. Your textbooks, your documentaries, your teachers who meant well, your museums with half-truths carved into marble. They told you Africa had no books. They told you it had no writing. That history came only through drums and stories passed by firelight. That knowledge started somewhere else. Greece, Rome, Europe. But they were wrong. Hidden beneath the Saharan sands lies a city that once held the world's most advanced libraries. Its name? Timbuktu. Not a myth, not a metaphor, not just a faraway word for middle of nowhere. Timbuktu was once the center of learning on Earth. In the 14th to 16th centuries, while plague swept through Europe, while the Black Death decimated cities and church bells rang for the dead, a different bell was ringing in Mali. The bell of scholarship, of science, of script. Timbuktu had over 150 schools, thousands of students, and libraries that housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, bound in leather, written in ink made of river mud, gold dust, and crushed herbs. These weren't just religious texts. They were mathematical equations, medical case studies, celestial charts, trade contracts, legal debates, philosophical dialogues, botanical treatises, epic poetry. Some predicted eclipses centuries in advance. Some mapped star systems before Europe had telescopes. Some debated ethics more nuanced than Enlightenment salons would touch until the 1700s. Yet today, when you say Timbuktu, people laugh. They think of it as a joke, a punchline, a vanishing point on the map. How do you erase a city of books? Easy. You don't burn it, you rename it. You bury it in silence. You make it sound like a fable, not a fact. You show pictures of mud huts and none of manuscripts. You photograph poverty and never the pages. Timbuktu became shorthand for nowhere, precisely because it was once everywhere in knowledge. Its name was feared by colonizers, envied by traders, respected by scholars from Cairo to Cordoba. But none of that made it into your classroom. Ask yourself why. Because history is not just what happened, it's what gets remembered, and who gets to remember it. Timbuktu remembered, Africa remembered, but the world chose to forget. When Europeans carved maps of Africa, they did not draw books. They drew beasts. They drew empty spaces. They called it Dark Continent, not because there was no light, but because they refused to see it. But now, we look again. Now, we dust off the books. Now, we unbury the truth. Timbuktu was not a lost city. It was targeted for erasure. Its manuscripts hidden in walls, smuggled under robes, buried in iron chests, passed down from grandfather to son like gold, because knowledge was gold, and Africa protected its gold. This is not nostalgia. This is not myth. This is evidence. This is resistance. This is memory made of ink. In Timbuktu, they didn't just write history. They debated it. They dissected it. They documented it in Arabic, Fulani, Songhai, and Ajami. They built an archive where African minds met Islamic science, Mediterranean trade, and Saharan resilience. And we were never supposed to know. Because once you know, you start to ask questions. Like why your school books skipped from Egypt to Greece without mentioning Kush. Why Columbus discovered lands mapped in older hands. Why Galileo is a genius, but ancient Malian astronomers remain anonymous. Why libraries in Africa had to be saved in silence, while European libraries were funded in public. Why Timbuktu was real, but made to feel impossible. They lied to you, but that ends here. Because the manuscripts speak, the stars still shine, and the desert has memory. And memory always finds its way back to light. The desert has memory, and memory always finds its way back to light. But before Timbuktu, before the libraries, before the scholars gathered by candlelight beneath domes of mud brick and stars, Africa had already built worlds of knowledge. The lie runs deep. They told you civilization moved from east to west, that wisdom flowed from Mesopotamia to Athens, from Rome to London. But they omitted the Nile. They skipped the Sahel. They passed over Nubia, Kemet, Aksum, Mali, as if these lands held only silence. In truth, Africa was never the edge of history. It was the spine. The place where gold was currency, but knowledge was power. Start with Kemet, ancient Egypt. It was not an isolated miracle, but the northern mirror of a southern continuum. Kemet was African. Its language evolved beside Nubian tongues. Its medicine came from Nilotic herbs. Its gods rose from the same river that fed the ancestors of Mali and Ghana and Songhai. Kush and Nubia didn't follow Egypt. They rivaled it. They outlived it. The city of Meroe forged iron while Europe still carved bronze. The queens of Nubia, the Kandake, commanded armies and sat on thrones long before Boudica or Joan of Arc. In Aksum, stones spoke Ge'ez. In Jenne, walls were built without blueprints. In Kilwa and Sofala, ships traded spices and science before Portugal learned to sail. But no city would unite trade and thought the way Timbuktu did. Strategically placed at the curve where the Niger River bends northward into desert, Timbuktu was a hinge. It connected the Mediterranean to the Sahel, the gold mines of Wangara to the salt mines of Tagaza, the Muslim world of Cairo and Mecca to the ancestral knowledge of Africa's interior. Camel caravans didn't just carry salt and cloth. They carried books. They carried ideas. They carried curricula, copied by hand, traded by value, preserved by reverence. By the 1300s, 3 major universities flourished in Timbuktu: Sidi Yahya, Djinguereber, Sankore. But it was Sankore that became the beating heart of this intellectual empire. Founded by a wealthy Mande woman, yes, a woman, Sankore wasn't just a mosque. It was a university complex, with multiple libraries, classrooms, dormitories, and a rigorous academic system. You didn't just memorize. You debated. You defended your thesis. You moved through levels, from novice to expert, under the guidance of a master. It was said a student could not graduate until they had memorized the Quran, mastered logic, astronomy, law, and grammar, and demonstrated moral clarity. This wasn't rote religion. This was enlightenment. At its peak, Timbuktu had over 25,000 students in a city of 100,000 people. That would be like Harvard enrolling a quarter of Boston. Manuscripts flowed in from Cairo, Fez, Damascus, but more were written there, in African hands. Subjects ranged far beyond theology: mathematics, physics, medicine, astronomy, history, geography, philosophy, botany, ethics, poetry. One text explored the healing properties of local trees. Another calculated solar calendars alongside lunar ones. A third analyzed trade routes by moonlight and wind. Some manuscripts were only a few pages. Others stretched hundreds, copied with reed pens in precise calligraphy, passed from teacher to student like sacred heirlooms. The libraries? They were family legacies. Entire homes built shelves around their walls. Fathers left manuscripts in their wills. Mothers stitched leather bindings. Children were taught to guard them, not as relics, but as living voices. Timbuktu didn't just preserve knowledge, it produced it. It crossbred Greek logic with African cosmology. It infused Islamic jurisprudence with Fulani social ethics. It merged the stars of Arabia with the skies of the Sahara. Europe, at the same time, was burning women for herbs. Timbuktu was cataloging plant-based medicine in multi-volume works. Europe built cathedrals of stone. Africa built cathedrals of thought. Yet none of this survived the curriculum you were given. You were taught about Oxford and Cambridge, but not Sankore. You heard of the Renaissance, but not the Mande Awakening, the flowering of art, trade, theology, and science in Mali. You read about the Silk Road, but not the salt gold book road that stretched from Timbuktu to Tripoli. Why? Because maps don't just chart geography, they assign value. And when Europe drew Africa, they placed its treasures underground. They erased cities and drew wilderness. They mapped the minerals, but not the manuscripts. They showed the veins of gold, but not the brains that mined it. Timbuktu stood as a threat, not because it was wild, but because it was wise. They could colonize land, but ideas had to be buried deeper. So they called it legend. They called it myth. They turned it into a joke, a place so far it must be fake. But Timbuktu was real, and it was central, not peripheral, not marginal, not also or once. It was core to the human story. And every manuscript that survived proves it. When a page of Timbuktu survives, it's not just paper. It's proof that Africa wrote itself. Proof that Africa thought globally, traded intellectually, and imagined the cosmos in its own terms. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. Africa was documenting while others were forgetting. This is not a reimagining. This is a reframing. The question is not whether Timbuktu was great. The question is, why were we taught to forget it? They painted her with kohl and curves. They reduced her to perfume and seduction, a woman of whispers, a queen of lovers. But Cleopatra was not the fantasy. She was the strategy, and that is what made her dangerous. She ruled Egypt not as a puppet or placeholder, but as a sovereign, a speaker of 9 languages, a scholar of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and politics, a woman who debated Roman generals in Greek and administered Nile taxation in Demotic. They say she bewitched Caesar. They say she seduced Mark Antony. But what they don't say is that she outmaneuvered them both. She kept Rome at bay for nearly 2 decades, not with beauty, but with brilliance. She held one of the last true African kingdoms in her hands, and the empire wanted it gone. Plutarch noted her intelligence. Cassius Dio acknowledged her charisma. But both Roman historians, even as they chronicled her diplomacy, emphasized the danger of her presence. Because Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was a threat to the narrative. The Nile had always been sovereign. Now it had a woman who embodied that sovereignty. She was not black in the way modern discourse often seeks clarity, but she was African. Born in Alexandria, raised in Nile culture, descended from Macedonian Greeks who married into Egyptian priesthood. A hybrid of 2 worlds, ruling one of the oldest on earth. Her skin was likely olive gold, her mind sharper than Roman steel. To Rome, she was both other and equal, and that terrified them. So Octavian, later Augustus, launched not just a military campaign, but a linguistic one. He called her a seductress, a snake, a sorceress, the enemy of Rome. He didn't attack her armies, he attacked her image. He didn't conquer with force, he conquered with narrative. Because when you can't defeat a woman's power, you reduce it to desire. You rewrite her sovereignty as scandal. You make her the last gasp of a fading Egypt, not the crescendo of a thinking one. Hollywood continued what Octavian started. Cleopatra became white. Cleopatra became coy. Cleopatra became Elizabeth Taylor. No script showed her building a naval fleet. No frame showed her commanding emissaries in Greek, Coptic, and Latin. No film dared to show her debating law beneath the stars of Memphis. Her intellect was cropped, her legacy bleached, her image sold. Even her nose, the most referenced feature in Western accounts, became a symbol of ridicule, as if the shape of her face could determine the fate of empires. They feared her mind, so they focused on her body. But the real Cleopatra was not made of perfume and pearls. She was made of scrolls, of statecraft, of survival. She knew how to manipulate power because she was born into its storm. Raised in the library of Alexandria's shadows, tutored by scholars trained in both Aristotelian logic and Egyptian cosmology. She embodied the knowledge of two worlds, Africa and the Hellenic Mediterranean. And when the world tilted toward empire, she tilted back. She fed her people through famine. She stabilized coinage in chaos. She opened her courts to scholars fleeing war. She maintained religious festivals to keep the priesthood intact, even as Rome pressed for conversion. She was not the fall, she was the resistance. And her death, staged as a suicide by snakebite, was never confirmed. Some say it was a poison, others a dagger, still others murder cloaked in myth. What matters is that after she died, Rome claimed her memory. Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, was hunted and killed. Her coins were melted, her statues defaced, her name smeared. She went from sovereign to seductress, from leader to lover, from strategist to scandal. This was not accident. It was erasure by design. Because if Cleopatra remained in history as she truly was, an African queen with intellect, power, and autonomy, then empire would have no monopoly on civilization. She stood at the threshold between Nile and Rome, between legacy and occupation, between story and propaganda, and we believed the propaganda. But today, historians like Islam Esa have re-examined her bloodline. Egyptian scholars have reanalyzed her iconography, and new generations ask, if she wasn't white and wasn't just Greek, then who was she? The answer is not in color, it's in context. Cleopatra was a symbol of African political literacy, of woman-led sovereignty, of cosmopolitan knowledge rooted in African soil. She represents the part of African history that didn't just survive Rome, it dared to negotiate with it. And that's why she was erased. Because it is easier to teach Cleopatra as temptation than as testament. It is easier to remember her as romance than as resistance. But when we restore her mind, we restore a world that believed in female rulers, science without superstition, and diplomacy without surrender. The Nile remembers. Its waters still reflect her temples. Its stars still follow the patterns her scholars mapped. Its daughters still carry the memory of a woman who defied empire with wisdom, not war. They told you Cleopatra was a myth. They were afraid she was real. They tell you Columbus crossed the Atlantic first. They honor his ships, his date, his flags. They celebrate 1492 like it was the beginning of time. But what if someone crossed the Atlantic before him? Not from Europe, but from Africa. Not for conquest, but for discovery. His name was Abu Bakr II, or Mansa Muhammad ibn Ku, the ruler of the Mali Empire, the same empire that birthed Timbuktu's libraries and Mansa Musa's wealth. He sat on the golden throne of West Africa, but he gave it up, voluntarily, to chase the edge of the sea. The story comes from Al-Umari, a 14th century Arab historian. He interviewed Mansa Musa, Abu Bakr's successor, during Musa's pilgrimage to Cairo in 1324. When asked how Musa became king, he said, "The one who ruled before me did not believe that the Atlantic Ocean had an end. He built a fleet of 200 ships and sent them west. Only one returned. It said, 'We saw a river in the sea.' All the others vanished. So he built 2,000 more ships and sailed with them himself. He was never seen again, not killed, not defeated, just vanished. Into mystery, into possibility. Modern historians call it a legend. But let's break it down, piece by piece. First, the feasibility. Could someone in 1311 sail from West Africa to the Americas? Yes. In fact, the ocean would have helped. The Canary Current, a major Atlantic current, flows from the West African coast straight toward South America. So do the northeast trade winds. If you set sail from Senegal or Gambia in the right season, you don't need steam. You need sails and knowledge. The same winds that carried Columbus, carried earlier ships, The sea doesn't care about nationality. It responds to navigation. And Mali had the tools. Arab traders, Berber merchants, and Mande sailors exchanged maps and instruments. The Mali Empire wasn't landlocked. Its rivers fed into the Atlantic. Its gold reached Morocco. Its salt fed cities as far as Cairo. It knew movement. It knew scale. And it had resources. A king who could organize thousands of ships for trade, could build ships for exploration. Wood from the river valleys, sails from West African cotton and woven fibers, navigation from oral knowledge passed across generations, cloud patterns, seabird behavior, and the stars. This wasn't fiction. It was African maritime science. Second, the textual proof. Alumari recorded this story not from folklore, but from a sovereign's mouth. Mansa Musa. And Musa had no reason to lie. He was already rich, already revered. He spoke it as fact. European scholars dismissed it. Why? Because it didn't fit the script. The idea that an African king reached the Americas before Europe shattered the myth of Western discovery. So they called it a fable. They footnoted it out of history. But ask yourself, how often do rulers give up thrones? How often do they fund expeditions of thousands? It wasn't madness. It was mission. Abu Bakr II did not go west to rule. He went to learn, to see what lay beyond the salt horizon. Imagine that. An African monarch not seeking slaves or silver, but understanding. That is not the profile of a conqueror. It is the spirit of a scientist. Third, the physical clues. In 1311, if Abu Bakr's ships reached the Americas, would they leave a trace? Not cities, not colonies, but contact. In Central and South America, traces of African presence have sparked debate. Some scholars point to Negroid facial features on pre-Columbian Olmec heads, carbon-dated tobacco and cocaine in Egyptian mummies, suggesting transatlantic botanical exchange reports by Columbus himself of black-skinned people in the Caribbean, who came from the south and southeast with trade goods in canoes. None of these prove everything, but together they ask, could it have happened? And more urgently, why don't we teach the question? Science welcomes doubt, but it fears silence. We don't need certainty to restore agency. We need curiosity. We need courage to say, yes, an African king might have crossed first, and that possibility matters. Because if Abu Bakr II reached the Americas in 1311, it wasn't a footnote. It rewrote the chapter. It meant Africa was not isolated. It was exploratory. It was engaged. It was bold. And maybe, just maybe, Columbus didn't discover a new world. He followed old winds to an old connection. The sea remembers. Its currents carry more than ships. They carry memory. And memory, like waves, returns. Abu Bakr II disappeared into myth. But myth, in Africa, is not fiction. It is memory coded in story. He left no tomb, no crown, no statue. But he left a question, bold as any map. What if we've been drawing history backward? You've heard the stories, you've seen the maps, you've followed the kings and queens. But now we ask, where is the proof? Because history isn't what people say. It's what survives, on parchment, in ink, etched into maps, buried in earth, stamped into coin, copied by hand. Africa's proof was never lost. It was hidden, dismissed, stored in trunks while museums filled with marble. But the receipts remain, and we are here to read them. First, the manuscripts of Timbuktu. Over 700,000 pages still exist, stored in private homes, smuggled through war zones, preserved by families who refused to let knowledge die. They were written between the 13th and 17th centuries, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in Arabic, Ajami, Fulani, and Songhai. They cover far more than religion. A 15th century astronomical chart aligns lunar calendars with solar movements, correcting for leap years with precise algorithms. A 14th century legal code outlines commercial law, inheritance rights, and even liability for damaged goods in caravan trade. Medical texts describe the symptoms and treatments for over 60 diseases, including fevers, eye infections, and mental distress, some with herbal remedies now validated by pharmacology. Poetry volumes explore themes of exile, divine justice, love, grief, drought, and celestial longing. Economic ledgers record price fluctuations for salt, gold, slaves, and manuscripts across centuries. Some volumes are full of marginal notes, teachers debating, students questioning, ideas evolving. This was not rote copying. This was live scholarship, and it tells us something powerful. Africa was not just transmitting knowledge, it was generating it. Second, the Catalan Atlas, drawn in 1375 by Abraham Cresques, a Jewish cartographer from Majorca. It's one of the most important maps of the medieval world. Europe at the top, the Islamic world sprawling across the center, and then West Africa. There, seated on a golden throne, is a black man holding a golden orb. Beneath the image, in Latin script, it reads, "This king is the richest and most noble of all. He rules over Mali, where gold is born. His name, Mansa Musa." The map was not made by Africans, it was made by Europeans, but even they could not ignore the wealth and power of Mali. The Catalan Atlas doesn't just confirm Mali's existence, it documents its importance. And the image, gold-robed, commanding, central, directly contradicts the colonial narrative that Africa was empty before contact. That map, drawn 117 years before Columbus set sail, proves that Africa was already mapped, respected, and engaged in global discourse. Third, the physical and textual debris. History leaves traces. Africa's traces are everywhere, if you know where to look. Ancient mosques in Mali and Niger show mathematical proportions matching Islamic golden ratios, long before the Renaissance praised Vitruvian man. Iron-smelting sites in Nigeria's Nok region, dating back to 1000 BC, reveal metallurgy techniques more advanced than those in Europe at the same time. Egyptian tombs show hieroglyphs of ships with sails, trading incense and ebony from Punt, possibly the Horn of Africa, suggesting early sea navigation. In Latin America, as mentioned earlier, Columbus's logs mention black traders already in the Caribbean. Pre-Columbian sculptures, like the Olmec heads, show facial features debated for centuries, not as proof, but as puzzle. Even in language, the word Mansa appears in Caribbean oral traditions. Islamic calligraphy styles seen in Timbuktu have echoes in early mosque structures in Brazil and Suriname. None of these are smoking guns, but they form a trail. Because history is not always a headline. Sometimes it's a whisper, a line in a logbook, a star misnamed, a manuscript tucked behind a family wall. So let's be clear. What we know. The Timbuktu manuscripts are real, vast, and verified. The Catalan Atlas depicts Mansa Musa and confirms Mali's centrality. Trade between Africa and the Islamic world was rich, regular, and intellectual. What is likely? Timbuktu universities functioned at the level of medieval Oxford or Al-Azhar. African scholars contributed to global astronomy, botany, and medicine. West African sailors reached further than Europe recorded. What is debated? The extent of transatlantic contact before Columbus. The interpretation of physical artifacts in the Americas. The full content of uncatalogued Timbuktu manuscripts, still hidden or untranslated. But here's what is not debated. Africa had systems. Africa had scholars. Africa had science. The absence of acknowledgement is not proof of absence. It's proof of erasure. Because when they burned libraries in Baghdad, it was called a tragedy. When they looted Alexandria, it was called loss. But when they ignored Timbuktu, It was called normal. The receipts were there. We just weren't taught how to read them. But we're learning now, page by page, map by map, artifact by artifact. The proof was always there, waiting, not to shock, but to restore. History doesn't vanish, it's removed, not in silence, but with instruments, curriculum, canon, cartography, cinema. They didn't forget Africa, they edited it. The erasure wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Start with Rome. When Octavian defeated Cleopatra, he didn't just conquer Egypt, he rewrote its legacy. He turned the Nile from sovereign to subjugated. He made Cleopatra a lover, not a leader. He declared Africa ruled by emotion, not intellect. He stripped the Nile of its mathematics. He mocked the gods as superstition. He renamed the temples, the calendars, the queens. It wasn't just about land. It was about the narrative. Because if Africa could think, then Rome wasn't the origin of civilization. It was a reaction to it. And empire needs to believe it began the story. Next came maps. Medieval European cartographers drew the world not as it was, but as they wished it to be. Africa was rendered as emptiness, just beasts, rivers, and gold mines. Even the Catalan atlas, which praised Mansa Musa, drew no books, no libraries, no scholars, only gold. Because if Africa had gold, but not thought, then colonizing it looked like progress. They redrew Timbuktu as a rumor, deleted the Niger River's complexity, compressed centuries of scholarship into desert blankness. The map wasn't just geography, it was ideology. Next came the textbooks. Colonial education taught that history began in Greece, that Africa had no philosophy, that oral tradition meant inferiority. They taught us to say primitive instead of pre-colonial, to think in terms of discovery, not disruption. They named African kingdoms only by their fall, never by their laws, their thinkers, their books. In British schools, the curriculum skipped from Egypt to Rome, as if Nubia didn't exist, as if Kush never stood, as if Timbuktu never debated jurisprudence beneath the stars. Even in African countries, colonized education taught children to see Europe as light and themselves as shadow. The erasure was global and internalized. Then came museums, artifacts taken but never attributed. Masks labeled tribal scripts labeled undeciphered. Manuscripts locked behind glass, explained by voices who could not read them. The British Museum holds thousands of African artifacts, but rarely says who made them, why they were made, what knowledge they held. Because museums tell stories, and the silence is the story. Then came Hollywood. Cleopatra cast as Elizabeth Taylor, gods of Egypt cast without Egypt. Wakanda praised for imagining African genius, as if Timbuktu didn't already prove it centuries ago. Every time Africa reached for visibility, the camera reframed it. Dust instead of data, drums instead of dialogue, pain instead of power, and the audience believed it, because the images were repeated, and repetition becomes truth when history is absent. Even Google searches reflect it. Type Timbuktu, and the first results once showed poverty, not manuscripts. A travel joke, not a cultural hub. A myth, not a memory. Because algorithms are trained on stories, and stories are shaped by power. So yes, there was erasure. But more than that, there was rebranding. Africa wasn't silenced, it was overwritten. Science became sorcery. Maritime navigation became lucky drift. Women-led kingdoms became matriarchal anomalies. Scholarship became folklore. They didn't just delete the evidence, they redefined it. And then, they asked us to prove ourselves, in their terms, using their sources, measured by their rubrics. That is not education, that is control. Because once you define intelligence through a colonial lens, the entire continent looks invisible. This is the erasure engine. Not a single act, but a system. A system of naming, of framing, of selecting what gets remembered and who gets forgotten. A system that made Mansa Musa a meme, but hid his manuscripts. That made Africa the cradle of humanity, but not the mind of humanity. That celebrated pyramids, but questioned who built them. That archived conquest, but silenced philosophy. But history isn't obedient. It leaves fingerprints, in margins, in carvings, in songs, in the way elders still speak of stars and seasons and justice. The truth is not fragile, it's just buried. And the erasure engine is not invincible. Every manuscript digitized, every voice reclaimed, every map redrawn is a dismantling. They told you history is linear. It's not. It spirals. It resurfaces. Like the Niger in flood season. Like the memory of a queen misnamed. Like the manuscript hidden in a wall. The erasure engine ran for centuries, but it has run out of excuses. The evidence is too heavy. The voices too loud. The questions too sharp. And the lie too tired. They tried to bury history, but Africa did not forget. And now, neither will we. Because memory is a river, it might dry on the surface, but underground, it flows, waiting, winding, rising. And today, that current has become a wave, across the continent, across the diaspora, across the world. A new generation is digging up what was hidden, not with shovels, but with scanners, cameras, syllabi, poems, and code. The reclamation is here, and it has names. In Mali, Dr. Abdelkader Haidara has spent decades rescuing Timbuktu's manuscripts from fire, flood, and war. He led a secret mission during the rise of extremist groups, hiding thousands of texts in rice sacks and shipping trunks. Over 350,000 manuscripts were saved. They called him the badass librarian of Timbuktu. But what he really was a guardian of civilization. In South Africa, Professor P.L.O. Lumumba speaks across nations about Pan-African unity, legal reform, and intellectual sovereignty. His voice is not nostalgic, it is electric. In Senegal, the African Renaissance Monument now towers over Dakar, a bronze rebuke to colonial skylines. In Ghana, the Year of Return brought millions in the diaspora back to ancestral lands, not as guests, but as heirs. In the US, libraries are launching digital partnerships to scan and translate African texts. At Cornell, Harvard, and Howard University, the archives are growing. Scholars are finding what textbooks refused to teach. At the Brooklyn Museum, new exhibits interrogate who tells the story and why some statues have no names. Artists like Kehinde Wiley paint African presence into classic Western forms, reclaiming space on the canvas of empire. Poets like Warsan Shire lace memory with fire. Filmmakers like Haley Garima build alternate visual timelines. Musicians like Seun Kuti carry sonic lineage through horns and protest. Even TikTok, often dismissed, now pulses with voices decoding Cleopatra's erasure, retracing Mansa Musa's wealth, quoting Timbuktu's science. This is not revival. This is restoration. The world is remembering because Africa is remembering itself, and the tools are now global. Digitization. Thousands of Timbuktu manuscripts are being scanned and preserved by initiatives like Savama DCI and the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Curriculum reform. Pan-African educators are rewriting textbooks to include African kingdoms, scholars, and scientists, not just pharaohs or famine. Language revitalization. From Swahili to Wolof to Zarma, communities are reclaiming syntax as sovereignty. Museum labels. Scholars are demanding that plaques change, from unknown tribal object to Songhai medicinal staff, 15th century. Repatriation. Nigeria has begun to reclaim the Benin bronzes. Ghana seeks the return of sacred gold regalia. South Africa is petitioning for archives taken by the Dutch. It's slow, but it's happening. And it is not just academic, it's emotional, spiritual, generational. Because this is not just about history, it's about inheritance. A child who sees Mansa Musa on a map learns that wealth existed before chains. A girl who reads Queen Nzinga's letters knows that power once spoke her language. A student who opens a Timbuktu manuscript finds science written in his ancestor's hand. This is not romanticism, it's resistance, it's repair, and it requires all of us. To repost truth, to retell stories, to rebuild timelines, to demand that libraries in Europe acknowledge where their books came from, to ask museums not just for art, but for attribution, to teach our children that civilization did not wait for Europe. It welcomed it, then was looted by it. We do not reclaim history by erasing others. We reclaim it by restoring the whole. Every manuscript digitized, every archive translated, every statue renamed, every child who learns the name Sankore before Stanford is an act of revolution. This is not about guilt, it's about truth, it's about continuity, and it's about the choice to join it. Because the past is not dead, it's just been sleeping, and now we wake it up. One scholar, one scan, one voice, one view. We are the descendants of survivors, of scribes, of seafarers, of queens who would not kneel, of kings who stepped off thrones to chase the unknown, of students who debated law beneath desert stars. So now, we carry their torch, not as burden, but as beacon. This is your invitation. To unlearn, to relearn, to retell, to join the tribe and reclaim the story. History doesn't disappear. It waits, in ruins, in rivers, in the margins of maps, in the silence between myths. But now, the waiting is over. Because piece by piece the story has returned. From the shores of the Nile, where knowledge was carved in stone, to the hills of Kush, where queens ruled with iron and ink, to the libraries of Timbuktu, where stardust met script, to the Atlantic, where sails caught wind before Columbus ever dreamed of blue. The journey was never lost, only interrupted. But today, we complete the circuit. And what we find is not a broken continent, but a brilliant one. Africa was not the periphery, it was the pulse. Its manuscripts debated astronomy before Copernicus. Its laws defined justice before Blackstone. Its universities certified knowledge before most of Europe could read. This is not about nostalgia. This is about recognition. Because legacy is not what survives, it's what we choose to carry forward. And what we carry now is heavy, but beautiful. We carry Sankore. We carry Cleopatra, recontextualized. We carry Abu Bakr II as possibility, not myth. We carry Mansa Musa, not as a meme, but as a mapmaker of dignity. We carry the desert, not as emptiness, but as archive. We carry the manuscripts, not as relics, but as voices. And in doing so, we rewrite what legacy means. Legacy is not a statue, it's a question. What will you do with what you've inherited? Will we leave these stories behind museum glass? Or will we digitize, translate, teach, and amplify them? Will we let the old maps define our future? Or will we draw new ones, where Africa is not just a source, but a center? Because legacy is not passive, it's participatory. It is teachers rebuilding syllabi. It is youth reclaiming names. It is technologists scanning manuscripts in the Sahel. It is musicians sampling griots. It is historians following gold not just as currency, but as knowledge. It is every African child who looks at the stars and now knows. We named them too. It is every diaspora soul who whispers, "I was never disconnected, only disinherited." And that changes everything. Because once you realize that Africa didn't wait to be discovered, you stop waiting to be validated. You realize the sea is not a border, but a bridge. That the manuscript is not a luxury, but a lifeline. That history is not a wound, but a weapon. A weapon against silence, against shame, against the erasure engine, and what comes next is up to us. We must fund the digitization, demand curriculum reform, support creators retelling the story, refuse the narratives that make Blackness a tragedy and Africanness a footnote. We must elevate not just the monuments, but the mind that built them. Because Timbuktu was not a miracle. It was the result of investment, vision, and values, and it can happen again. A new Sankore, in Lagos, in Atlanta, in Accra, in Berlin, in Sao Paulo, built not just of bricks, but of books, code, culture, and connection. A continent of future thinkers who also remember. A diaspora of archivists, educators, artists, and scientists. A global tribe, not of blood, but of truth. Because this was never just about Africa. It was about what the world lost when Africa was suppressed. But now, the world listens, and we speak. Not in protest, but in proclamation. We were never voiceless. We were unheard. We were never behind. We were unacknowledged. We were never absent. We were erased, but not anymore. The desert has memory, and now, so do we. This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the correction. Let the maps reflect truth. Let the textbooks speak plainly. Let the names be restored. Let the stars return to their original languages. Because the books were buried, but not broken. The knowledge was hidden, but not gone. The legacy was attacked, but it survived. And now we speak it aloud, with clarity, with evidence, with power, with pride. Because we don't just retell history, we restore it with evidence and honor.